Hello! Welcome to the podcast, There Is No Spoon. In previous episodes, we talked about the baggage a person carries when approaching the midpoint pass, the ghosts they encounter along the way, and the internal processes they begin to engage with. One of the most important elements of this equation is old patterns that emerged in childhood and adolescence. When entering society, a person has to adapt. Adaptation is impossible without creating adequate behavioral strategies, which we often call life experience. However, what worked back then is not necessarily effective now. Yet these programs are the strongest. They make us repeat the same mistakes over and over again. But what if you don't see those mistakes? We need to look at this idea from a different angle. Where do the roots of endless repetition grow in the context of the midpoint pass? One possible answer is our wishful thinking about personal independence. Indeed, how does society characterize an adult? As an independent person, capable of making their own decisions and taking responsibility for them, able to live without relying on parents or other people. But if a person behaves as independent, does that mean they truly are? What is independence? ChatGPT provides the following quintessence. Independence is the state or ability to act independently, without anyone's help or guidance. It is a quality or skill that allows a person to make their own decisions, act on their own initiative, and provide for their needs without depending on others. Key phrases: without anyone's help or guidance, act on their own initiative, provide for their needs. The definition seems reasonable and elegant, but this is precisely where the boundary lies, at least for now, between knowledge, including that of artificial intelligence, and wisdom. Independence is considered a crucial quality. It is actively encouraged and approved by society. Its necessity is emphasized in school, university, at work, and so on. Behaving as a non-independent person means being ostracized by those in power. However, behaving as an independent person and being independent are two different things. This is where the demarcation line lies. If a certain John is an adequate, well-adapted 30-year-old person, he will most likely fit the previously mentioned definition. He will act outwardly, independently, without direct help or guidance. It will seem that he makes his own decisions and acts on his own initiative. The key words here, however, are verbs. Will seem, will act outwardly independent. In other words, everything looks proper and respectable on the outside. But what about the inside? Here we must ask, where does John get the initiative to do something? How does he determine when and how to act? And this is where disappointment comes in. To a large extent, John's actions are not determined by himself, but rather by the ingrained patterns within him. He simply repeats learned behaviors, actions that he believes will bring him happiness and be well received by society. Can this be called independence? I wouldn't say so. For behavior to be truly independent, one must ask, which desires are truly mine, and which are imposed by parents, society, and tradition? It's quite possible that answering this question won't be easy, and that the answer itself will be unpleasant. But this will be the first step to successfully crossing the pass, an adequate assessment of one's individuality in the current state. When speaking about an independent person, it is impossible not to mention that this quality is directly linked to the concept of responsibility. And not just responsibility for one's actions, but also responsibility toward oneself, for one's own life. And here we can also reflect on the nature of responsibility. One type is external responsibility. Essentially, this represents the internalized ideas about the rules of the game, or, in simpler terms, it is what we are taught from childhood and imposed upon by others. The number of obligations is endless. First, a child is told they must study. Why? To be successful. Numerous psychological studies show a correlation between education level and financial well-being. But is everyone destined to pursue academia or purely intellectual work? If we look at one of today's most popular professions, programming, honestly, a basic education is more than enough to start. Generations grow up with this obligation, spending 11 years in school and 4 to 6 years in university. And yet, I have encountered many situations where people finish their education at 23 to 25, only to realize they don't actually need it and would rather do something else. But so many resources have already been spent. And once again, the uncomfortable question arises: what now? Of course, social obligations extend far beyond this. One must work, provide, save for housing, buy a car, take vacations, exercise, care for the planet, and contribute to charitable causes. These musts are endless. But how many of them are truly important to us? The modern, successful, in quotation marks, middle-aged person has so many small and large obligations that it's unclear how they even survive. In Irish mythology, obligations known as geasa, not exactly the same, but with a similar connotation, were so burdensome that having one or two could make a hero suffer like Job. What chance does an Irish Cuchulainn have compared to modern John with hundreds of these burdens? Where does this lead? To the realization that no matter how hard one tries, it is impossible to meet all expectations. This naturally leads to the conclusion that not every obligation must be fulfilled. Some can simply be ignored. But the problem is that we ignore the wrong ones. Over the past year, I've talked to people who were in difficult situations. They didn't have enough resources to carry their burden. I asked them to make a priority pyramid. What was most important to them, then second most important, and so on. Then I had them compare this with how they were actually spending their time and resources. One can endlessly talk to a psychologist about the importance of family, relationships, and self-development. But if out of 16 free hours a day, a person spends 12 working, 2 on household chores, 1 on eating, and 1 on commuting, how does that align with reality? One can build castles in the air, but facts are stubborn things. This brings us to the idea of internal responsibility, the kind we have forgotten. This is responsibility toward oneself. No boss, no government, no society demanding dues and labor. There is only you and you alone. Responsibility for your own life, your path, your work, your hobbies, and so on. And yet, for some reason, this type of responsibility is often overlooked. But how can one be responsible to others without first being responsible to oneself? Here, our consciousness works against us. Having been conditioned from childhood to bear imposed responsibilities, we stop perceiving them as obligations and allow ourselves to neglect them. And by the principle of induction, which our consciousness loves, we apply this attitude to all types of responsibility, including internal responsibility. But while we can escape external problems, we cannot escape ourselves. So, in summary, both the idea of personal independence and the imposed horde of social obligations work against a person, leaving them neither peace nor resources for self-development. The only apparent escape seems to be a severe crisis or nervous breakdown when dragging the cart any further becomes physically impossible. Should it come to that? I don't know, but I do know that the decision is yours alone. Another major obstacle in the middle of the journey is circumstances and fate. I don't want to dive into deep philosophical debates about whether fate exists, how much control we have over it, and so on. I simply want to point out that while we are responsible for our own lives, everyone starts from different conditions, different backgrounds, and different circumstances. Think of the parable of the talents in the Bible. Yes, everyone will be held accountable, at the very least by themselves. But comparing yourself to others is a bad idea. Yes, maybe someone manages to work 8 hours, exercise, bake pies, and knit a scarf, while someone else can only crawl home and collapse in front of a TV series. But the question is not how much you do, but whether you do as much as you can and want to. I often see clients in situations where, objectively, circumstances are far from ideal. This reduces both motivation and available resources, and people start blaming themselves. But in reality, they are acting heroically. It's just that the standard they have set for themselves is unattainable. How does this affect passing the midpoint of the journey? Mostly indirectly. It forms the background against which you approach it. It's similar to immunity. With a strong immune system, a cold can pass quickly and painlessly. But if the immune system is weakened, the chances of complications increase. There is a simple conclusion to be drawn from this. Try to create a positive background for yourself. In other words, create an environment where you feel comfortable, but that is also open enough for growth and change. However, this is not always possible, unfortunately. The world is vast, and a person is not. But at the very least, you can assess your situation realistically and plan accordingly. Many who have read Jung expect that the midpoint of the journey is a confrontation with their shadow and animus. In a way, that is certainly true. And Jung's genius lies in the fact that, from countless scattered life stories, he was able to identify certain patterns that remain relevant to this day. But in reality, the midpoint is, first and foremost, a meeting with yourself. Not with the image you present in public by wearing this or that persona, but with who you truly are. Our shadow is not just an alter ego, Mr. Hyde, or Darth Vader. Our shadow is an honest and sober look in the mirror. It is the rejection of the idea that ignorance is bliss. This is one of my favorite illusions, both professionally and personally. I used to think that knowledge and experience would bring me more happiness and well-being. Now I can state that the correlation is exactly the opposite. The more you know and understand, the more aware you become, and the more painful this knowledge can be. That is why both Lucifer and Azazel are antagonists in the Judeo-Christian and therefore the entire Western myth. Because they bring the light of knowledge, but instead of helping people, it makes them more vulnerable to demons. Approaching the midpoint of the journey, a person is forced to start becoming aware or to pay for it with neuroses. But once you lift the veil, there is no closing it again. Once you see the world not in black and white, but in shades of gray, you can never return to the original picture. This is where the ambivalence of the phrase, ignorance is bliss, comes in. Indeed, the less you know, the less there is to trouble you. However, the problem is that this knowledge bursts into our cozy little world, as Jung rightly pointed out, and either we learn to live with it, or we betray ourselves, because that is the way. This was the podcast, There Is No Spoon. Until next time.